we will start now our webinar on the Green Deal and more precisely on Farm-to-Fork. The very aim of the agriculture policy dialogue is to improve the mutual understanding of the agriculture sectors between Germany and Brazil. And this is obviously a noble task and an important one, however, somehow a challenging one in recent times. Yeah, my name is Ingo Melchers. I'm head of the German-Brazilian Agriculture Policy Dialogue. And today we'll have the opportunity to listen and to discuss with Professor Christian Henning, the author of a study about the probable impacts of the European deal on agriculture, not only in the European Union, but also in Brazil. There is a widespread agreement, political agreement on the general goals of the Green Deal all over the European Union. Majority sees the necessity and the urgency of the transformation in the way we produce and consume. Decarbonization of the economy to better tackle with climate change is a widely accepted political agenda. Politically, there is no way back to a pre-Green Deal agenda. Currently, we can see some hiccups, controversial debates on and uncertainties concerning the Russian war against the Ukraine, concerning the high inflation, especially food and energy prices, but also in the housing area. However, we can be quite sure that the European Union won't stop creating rules in order to mitigate climate change. These rules do have impacts on commercial partners all over the world. And the logic is very simple. If Europe creates new and higher standards with higher costs for their own economy in order to tackle with the climate crisis that affects the whole Earth in the 21st century, it is logical that there must be one mechanism to equalize these different cost structures for the commercial partners abroad. Europe certainly will continue pushing forward this discussion and this policy. However, the same broad consensus within society may not exist when we talk about the agriculture policy agenda of the Green Deal or the so-called Farm-to-Fork strategy. There are some societal, political, and scientific issues and criticism in Europe, but also in Brazil, about the way the European Union wants to implement the Green Deal agriculture policy agenda, in which we will dive in today. Before we start, I have two housekeeping issues for us all. The first one is that we won't have any translation today, and so we have to deal with the Green Deal in English, what is quite a challenge, at least for me. And second, you may write your comments or questions into the chat or into the Q&A area, which we will hopefully be able to answer in the last 15 minutes. So in order to get heard, please try to be short and precise. So, Mr. Henning, I would like to present you now. It will be very interesting to listen to your presentation. And afterwards, we will have some specific points from Brazilian experts and representatives from government, science, and civil society. I will present them afterwards one by one. They certainly will put some emphasis on different comprehensions of what is meant to be sustainability in agriculture in Brazil and in Europe, and what are the most promising practices of tropical agriculture, for example, about the potential of low carbon agricultural approaches. I'm very happy to moderate this event because the agricultural policy dialogue understands well both sides. And we know that both comprehensions have a deep anchor in their respective societies and economies. As we do respect both sides, and therefore we guarantee a friendly and respectful atmosphere because we are definitely among friends here. But now, with no further delay, I would like to present Professor Christian Henning, main author of our study. Professor Henning is studied agricultural science, sociology, political science, economics, and even mathematics. Today, he is professor for agricultural policies and managing director of the Institute of Agricultural Economics at the University of Kiel in the north of Germany. Professor Henning, very happy to have you here today. You've got the floor, please, 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also very much for this nice introduction. I'm also very happy that we have this specific event. I very much look forward to a hopefully thought-provoking discussion. So, so the first part of this will be this presentation, which I named now European Green Deal, a global roadmap with a question mark, and then basically an international perspective on the impact of the farm-to-fork strategy. And so what or where, how I would like to start, just a second now, it doesn't work as it should. Okay, so I would like to start with the general background of these studies. Actually, these are two studies where I will try to summarize main results of, and this is which basically we all know, but global food systems are in disarray these days, and maybe again, but definitely these days. And the reason is, first, we can conclude that the present food systems are characterized by major market failures, basically in two ways. On the one side, on not only on the global, but also on the national level, these market mechanisms are basically less and less capable, or the right mechanisms to deliver what we call ecosystem services, so basically specific environmental goods, which society more and more demands, such as climate change, so basically emission reduction, but also reduction in nitrogen pollution, and also a specific level of biodiversity. So this is one part where more and more we see that the general market mechanism is not the right mechanism to govern these production activities, that society gets what it wants. On the other side, there was already mentioned the Russian war, but we also see, maybe not only there, but this is the maybe most critical part, where we all learned that we cannot really rely anymore on global markets. So basically, we might get into problems if we rely too much on global markets and on global market partners, which then might take advantage of specific market positions. And so even here, we are looking now for new arrangements, and for both reasons. And this is why there is a general trend, one could say, into the reformation or transformation of food system at national and global level. So starting from here, the European Union has started one big idea of transforming not only the agriculture or food system, but the complete economy, which is named under the Green Deal, but particular for the food system transformation in the European Union. We have the Green Deal. And what is behind the Green Deal, so what is about the implementation of the Green Deal in agriculture, is the so-called farm-to-fork strategy, which is at the moment just a proposal of the European Commission. And basically this strategy has 5 main measures, which is the reduction of mineral fertilizer use by 20%, reduction of pesticide use by 50%, reduction of the end balance surplus by 50%, a minimum share of ecological compensation conservation areas of at least 10%, and also a minimum share of organic or ecological farming of at least 25%. And the question is now, if we include these measures as suggested by the Commission, what will be the impact on agriculture? And this is what we did in our first study that was very much focused on the European Union. We did this with a model called Capri, and we did this at a regional level. So basically the impact on consumption and production pattern and trade patterns were modeled with the Capri model on a regional scale, which is as small as for all EU member states as a specific Bundesland in Germany. And so we not have in every EU country Bundesländer, but some similar administrative units. And the model gives the results on this level. On the other side, we also have all the impacts on international markets. And beyond the production patterns, this model also shows what happens with the environmental impact. So particular with emissions, with land use changes and emissions related to this, and also with nitrogen balance and biodiversity. And so this is what we did in the first study, which I call now Henning et al. From 2021. And this was the starting point of the second study. I will come in the next minutes. Now, to summarize, basically, to give you an impression what happens by the farm-to-fork strategy. This is what we see now on this slide, and I will guide you through. I don't expect that we will talk about each number, but basically what the farm-to-farm measures are restriction on production. And here you see on this side where I'm with the mouse now, the red part is implementing the complete package, so every 5 measures. And then we also, I will not go into this detail, but partly I will, and we see colored the different measures. So we simulated the impact for implementing all 5 measures at once, and then implementing measure by measure. And this is what you see. And the first thing is, because this is a restriction of production, what we get is a restriction in supply, so a reduction in supply. And the question is, how high is it? And what we see here, if I take now the red color, it's quite high. This is percentage. So compared to a base run, this is the cut we modeled, which will happen in 2030. And this is the cut compared to if there would be not such a thing like farm-to-fork. And then we see that beef and pork is heavily reduced by 20% and 70%. We also see that oil seeds and cereals are roughly reduced by 20%, and a little less it's fruit and vegetables, and even less dairy products, but still it's a sizable decrease. On the other side, based on this supply reduction and normal reaction on restriction on the supply side, is that prices are increasing, and these are internal price increases induced by this package, farm-to-fork package, and these are extremely high. These are farm gate prices. We have to make this difference. I will come to this. So we see that this is for animal sector, especially pork and beef, it's 50 and even more than 50 for beef percentage increase in prices. We even have for dairy a very high increase of at least 35, and a little less, but still significant increases for crop production, roughly between 15 and 20%. Now, because of this price increases in the European Union, of course, we have induced trade flows. And basically what happens is that net imports into the European Union, because internal prices are increasing, will increase. And this is what you see on the next slide here. And this is now related to the internal production. So this is how much does the net export increase in percentage of internal EU production, and this is quite high. It's roughly around 15%. It's less for dairy. Now, having this impact on international trade, of course, we also have a price response on international market. This is what we see here in the last graph, so to say, or table. And we see that we also have some significant price increases on international markets. For example, 10% for pork and 7.4% for beef, roughly 10% for dairy, and lower for crop products. But what you see that these extremely high price responses internally, which are roughly 50%, are not reflected internationally. There are increases, but far, far less compared to the internal price increases. And this is logic if we see that this trade is basically characterized by a specific stickiness in the value chain, and this is what we see here. We can discuss about this partly if you use the standard, the simple, which is not realistic anymore, and trade the theory, then you would expect that the price changes are the same as internal and external prices, but giving the realistic view on trade flows, and this is not going to happen. Finally, what we see, and this is this graph here, and this is what it's all about, we see a big increase or a significant increase in ecological services. So basically, we see a decrease in emission, CO2 emission. We see a large decrease, 50% of nitrogen balances, and we also see an increase in biodiversity. I don't want to go into detail here. I will show the more figures in the summary of all of this, but we have, of course, an increase. This is why we do this reform in ecosystem services. And finally, we have an impact on socioeconomic welfare. If we do some restriction on production, this is related to cost, and someone has to pay the bill. And these welfare effects, this is economic welfare only, and basically is interesting. This is related, basically the large part or everything is burdened by the consumers. They have a loss of basically 17 billion euros in 2030 together per head. This is not so much, I will come to this. And the pharma sector in total has a profit increase. This is basically because the price reaction overcompensates the production restriction. And but we also have some losers on the agro-processing industries. They are going to lose roughly 25% of their profits in 2030. This is the dairy processing and also oil processing industry, which is modeled within the Capri model. So basically, this is what it is. Now, to summarize this complete analysis, the Green Deal, implementing the Green Deal as suggested by the Commission, definitely has potential. We get additional ecosystem services. That's what we want. And now we also could in the study relate this with the willingness to pay for these ecosystem services into financial terms. And this means we have, if we would implement the total Green Deal implementation, so full reduction of CO2 emissions and of nitrogen pollution, then we have an amount of 320 billion euros, which is at least 2,000 euros per hectare, or 750 euros per capita population, and total farm profits could be as high as, only from this, 70 billion. So we see that this is a very great potential, but the farm-to-farm strategy as it is only realized 30% of this potential. That's the first result. And why is this so? So what can we tell about improving this? One thing is that the way the Commission suggested to proceed is not the most efficient way to realize this net benefits. So basically what we would need, of course, is we need more flexible measures which allow that also innovation will take place. And this is not yet done in the strategy of the Commission. And the second part for this is that we have to think about where the Commission just came up with some numbers saying something like 50% nitrogen balance reduction. Why not 40%? Why not 60%? And 25% ecological farming. Why not 12%? Why not 35%? So one can also think about optimizing along the scale of the measures, and one can also think about including new measures. I will come to this. A second reason why the farm-to-fork strategy, at least to our study, will not be efficient is so-called leakage effect. On the one side, we have, which might be also very relevant for Brazil, we have production transformation. If we restrict production in the EU, of course, we increase production somewhere else of the world, and increasing production somewhere else means that there are also environmental effects. And so partly these effects, if there are increased emissions, for example, will counterbalance the positive effect on environmental impact in the EU. A second spillover or leakage effect comes from land use change. These additional farm profits which are realized by Farm-to-Fork, induce, of course, a higher demand for agricultural land. And so there is land use change towards agriculture area, mainly forest land will be reduced. And because of this reduction, we have again additional emissions which come up into the leakage effect. And the last thing I want to talk about today is political feasibility. Even if we now can find an optimal strategy, the question is to what extent this will really be implemented within the European Union, to what extent this is really politically feasible, whatever we think it's best to do. Now, the first part now comes that I would like to think about a little bit more about what are smart policies. If it is not exactly what the Commission suggested, what would it be? And then here, basically, we see 3 access points. We can, what the Commission did already, take the access point farm production. So we can regulate farm production, we can pay subsidies or taxes, or we can implement what we call permit trading. So basically we have certificates, environmental certificates, which we define and let them trade on an open market. It's a little bit what we have already with the ETCS system for CO2 permits trading, but the agriculture sector is not included. So we will think about what is if we will implement this also for agriculture. A second access point would be the consumption side, which is not considered by the Commission yet. And the consumption side is 2 ways. One, we can go to food waste, so reducing food waste. And so basically doing some interventions on the consumption side. And the second access point on the consumption side will be healthy diet. We know that at least the European population, I guess this is also true for Brazil, they have, compared to what is considered as a healthy diet, far too much or too high animal, especially meat consumption. And now if we would introduce a more healthy diet or a perfect healthy diet, and then the idea is this would restrict the demand side and finally can also end up with more positive environmental impacts on the production side. Now, the third part is trade. And because we saw the leakage effects, which basically come for production transformation to the rest of the world. So one idea might be we can additionally restrict trade, basically import restriction, just to circumvent or to reduce at least this leakage effect. So I will also think about it. But the first thing, I have to speed up a little bit because of the time, is that we thought about taking the measures as they are, just adding the CO2 permit trading, and additionally to the Farm-to-Fork measures. And then we use the Capri model again, or basically a meta model of the Capri model, to find the optimal mix. So basically we do not just use one scale the Commission suggested, but we just try to maximize net benefits looking for any scale. So just let the model decide how much ecological farming, how much nitrogen balance reduction we want to have, just to maximize our social welfare. And so basically by doing this, I will come to this in a second, we use the model, and here you see what the model gives us. Basically, this is now on the y-axis, we see the greenhouse gas emissions. So if this is high, we have high emissions. And we see on the x-axis, we see different policy measures. You do not know exactly what is the measure, but I like this. I will explain in a second. But now if you see that this means from 0 to a higher scale means that you have a higher intensity of the policy measure. And let's say this is the CO2 price. And now we have an increasing CO2 price. And now we see what happens to the emissions. We see nicely that increasing the permit price really reduces emissions. This is what we want. This is the policy we like, because we can really control emissions by this policy. Now, if we take this policy, basically, this means 0 intensity. This means high intensity. But what we see is if it's 0 or high, basically, we don't see any systematic impact on our emissions. And this is just ecological farming. So basically what we see from the model, there is not much sense in increasing ecological farming because it has no positive impact on CO2 emissions. contrasted with permit prices. We also see this for other reasons. This is N balance, for example, at least here we see some impacts. Basically, this is what we use. We did it also for surplus, and here we see again, this is reducing directly the surplus balance is very effective. Doing this with CO2 is also effective. Doing this with ecological farming is not effective at all. Now, considering all of this, and we come up with the optimal policy, and the optimal policy just has basically 3 measures. It just has a pesticide reduction of 75%. It just has a very high CO2 permit price. So you can also understand this as a tax, but it's a permit market. It's almost 280. And a certain measure is that we also have a very high restriction of the N balance. That would be the optimal policy setup based on our model. We compared this with the original farm-to-fork strategy, and then we included 2 other options, which we call farm-to-fork eco and farm-to-fork soft. Farm-to-fork soft is this based on a stakeholder questionnaire we did. This is the policy position favored by agribusiness. Basically, they agree, as we heard already in the introduction, they agree with the targets, with the goals of the Green Deal, but they think, well, we just have to rely on the sector. This will be very innovative, so we don't have to do so hard measures, just do a little bit of this, just a little bit taxing CO2, just a little bit reducing N balances, and the rest will come from technical progress. This is what we basically see here. And the second narrative in the stakeholder survey we found was what we called farm-to-fork eco, and this is basically environmental organizations, and they very much restrict all mineral fertilizer inputs, all industrial inputs, so pesticides, and they also favor very much ecological farming and ecological set-aside. And this is what we see here, but they don't think that we need directly put a high permit price, and we also don't need restricting the N balance. And this is what we see here with farm-to-fork eco. And now we simulated again for all of these 4 scenarios, the outcomes, and compared this to the farm-to-fork strategy, which is here, which I already explained. And now if you first look on the different bar charts, this bars here, and then I will come to the lines. So the bars are basically the ecosystem services. And what we see here is, for example, gray is the N balance, nitrogen balance. The orange is the greenhouse gas emission balance, which here is negative. Under the optimal, it's almost 60 or over 60%, compared to only 20% under farm-to-fork. And we see that farm-to-fork eco and farm-to-farm soft does not have a big effect on ecological services. You see, compared to optimal and even compared to farm-to-fork, we don't get much here. Now, if we look on the lines, and because of time, I just will stick for 2 lines. So this is what the consumers have to pay, and the scale is here. This is in percentage, and we see that this is negative here. So we see that, of course, doing the optimal policy will induce more cost, almost 1%, not it's less, it's 0.9% of per capita income. And this is far less under soft and also under eco and also under farm-to-fork. But of course, we just have to pay for the product, right? We get much more product, and of course, we have to pay a little bit more. What is very interesting is that the blue line, which is farm profits, they are even maximal under the optimal strategy, and they are very, very low under soft and eco farm-to-fork. So this basically is it. Here, because of time, I will skip. We have also this in real figures. This is in billion euros, and this is also per capita. And what we see is that the net benefits of the optimal, which is this here, farmers, consumers, and total society, are much, much higher than compared to what the Commission suggested, and even tremendously higher compared to what the society wants. If it is agribusiness or if it is environmental organizations. So the last thing is, well, why not do other measures? And there was one thing is healthy planet ideas, and the other thing is restricting trade, like a soya ban. I will come to this. And now basically the message is, if you look on this is just blue, the original farm-to-fork effect, and then then you see orange and gray, what you would get with a healthy diet and what you get with a soya ban. And to make a long story short, basically nothing. Right? So it's nice, it's a nice idea, goes in the right direction, but you cannot get much on the environmental impact of agriculture production if you just try to do it over the consumer side, or if you want to do it over trade. At least not if you just keep it. Of course, you can restrict consumption as far that nobody consumes anything, that you will get it. But if you just restrict to a healthy diet, which is the only thing which logically makes sense, the effect is simply quasi zero. Okay, now impact on international markets. I will skip this. Basically, I explained this. And we basically see that on international market, we have price effects. And these price effects, the main message is if we have a very restrict farm to fork, so we very much restrict our agriculture to produce ecosystem services and less of the conventional products, this has a positive impact on prices. And for a country like Brazil, which is one of the major exporters for almost everything I just learned in agriculture, at least, and which is also one of the top producers in almost everything in agriculture, they take away a big benefit from this. But again, keep in mind, price changes on international markets, and this is directly Brazilian market, are not so high. This is just 4%. So we see these are just different scenarios of this soya ban, but of this different farm to fork strategy. Sorry, this is soft, this is eco, and here we see the original farm to fork and the optimal farm to fork strategy. But we see that the price changes are positive, and this means they are welfare enhancing, but they are not extremely big. Now, this is soya ban, which we did in an extra study. And the main message is the soya ban is exactly contrary to the farm to fork, because if we ban soya, then we have a negative impact on international prices, at least for oil seeds, for soya. And this has a negative impact on Brazil. And we also see that in other markets, price changes are far less, but for Brazil, they are also slightly negative. So, but what we don't see is in particular, but I want to mention this, we did land use changes within the model as well. And the land use changes of the soya ban are positive, because we have a reduction or an increase in forestation by as much as 1.4 million, but this is total South America, but the large part would be happen in Brazil. For the farm to fork strategy, it would be the opposite. It's more attractive to use agricultural land, so deforestation would be at least tendenциally not as high as 1.4 hectares, a million hectares, but tendenциally be increased. So now the last part, I still have 1 minute, hopefully, is political feasibility. And now we take the optimal strategy. And the first question we asked is, well, this is from the viewpoint of total EU society. Now, first assume we have the different member states, and cost and benefits are differently distributed across member states of the European Union. And so what we modeled here, I just give you the summary, is we just modeled what would be the optimal strategy from the viewpoint of the different member states. And interestingly, and this is very homogeneous, almost the same optimal strategy for all the countries. There are only slight differences in terms of ecological areas, set-aside areas, and there are also very slight differences in the optimal carbon or permit price. But otherwise, they all would gain from this common strategy. But and the problem is, and this takes me to my takeaway measures, the big problem is that, of course, politics has its own logic. It's not about social welfare maximization, but it's its own logic. And so we have to look on winners and losers, and particular on perceived winners and perceived losers. So what we saw already is that if we do a stakeholder survey, that the perceived policy impacts are completely different to what our model says, but the real politics based on these narratives. And so what is the most realistic thing we can expect is that the environmental organization will make it and push their position through. So we will have Farm-to-Fork Öko, or that the agribusiness will manage again to push its position through, and then we will have Farm-to-Fork Soft. Both are not effective. And one big player who has a very big interest, even if we take the true technologies in avoiding farm-to-fork, is agribusiness industries. They are real losers of sustainable food system. And to make it short, the main reason is sustainability you cannot bring over the market. So agribusiness can only make money if it goes over the market. But sustainability will never go over the market, or only a very low part. And so they cannot make profit out of this. So these are definitely big losers. And I said already everything on the international perspective. Interestingly, Brazil, if they are just want to maximize their economic welfare, should favor a very strict and optimal farm-to-fork strategy, because then they can get the most economic net benefits out of it. But of course, we did not look yet into the negative impacts on environmental goods. But and the last thing is, and I will then finalize my presentation, in a way we have a little bit of tragedy of the common, in a way that on the one side we have a clear and technical win-win solution, basically for everyone, but in political reality, because this understanding true policy impacts is not so easy, it's complex. We have this biased narratives which drive political processes, and this just end up, this is how it looks like, in very suboptimal policies. So it is important what we have here, political dialogues between science and society, between different stakeholders, are very, very important to get out of this tragedy of the commons. And this is why I consider workshops or webinars like this as very helpful and important. So thank you very much, especially for giving me some extra minutes. Bye.
Professor Henning, thank you for this lesson. It's very interesting. I think it's a lot of food for thought for the comments to come in now. I will ask Mr. Ingo Plöger the first, because he has to go now. Ingo Plöger is definitely a pioneer in many different dialogue formats between Brazil and Germany, including the agricultural policy dialogue. Ingo has so many functions that I won't be able to announce them all. He is director at the ABAG, the Brazilian Agribusiness Association, and represents also the German-Brazilian Agribusiness Initiative. Ingo likes to discuss and is not afraid of controversies, but he definitely insists on dialogue, and decades of his friendship with Germany very much confirm his attitude of dialogue. Ingo, you are now in Porto Alegre and have another appointment and will have to leave soon. And you got 7 minutes or 8. If you struggle with me, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us today. Ingo.
Thank you so much, Ingo. I appreciate the initiative for the dialogue, Ingo, and you are a fantastic ambassador between and making bridges between all of the interests. Professor Christian Henning, thank you so much for the study and to send it up before. I must confess, I couldn't understand a lot of things, but now with your explanation, I could follow some of the simulations, and I'm very, very glad that you were very clear in some aspects. I'm very glad also to hear with friends like Hans-Peter, Juana, Fernando, that we could debate this issue. To be very straight ahead, I understood, Professor Henning, your scenarios, and I can follow the logics. But the scenarios were based on the Green Deal principles. So, and it's what you have. And these are European-based KPIs. So in the first issue, what my assessment is, I would appreciate very much if we could make a different scenario based on maybe different KPIs that are not only the European KPIs. I give you a few examples. When you see the reduction of agro-defensive pesticide under 50%, and you said, why not 40, why not 60? Okay, we can measure that and see the impacts. But the European Green Deal assumption gets from assumption out that you used hectares per year. So how much tons you use in each hectare per year. That's okay for Europe because you have one harvest per year. But if you see tropical situation, we have in some cases 2 to 3 harvests. So hectare per year is not adequate for that. Better could be tons or kilo per tons, produced tons. So that's different. In this kind of scenarios, you have different results. A second example for that too is the assumption of the European Union is to get until 2050 under a closed market. They will not open the agriculture market until 2050. So if you have a closed market, you have other logic about land use. Yeah, and this kind of land use, you have different kind of emissions, productivities, and so on. If you have open markets, so supposing that European Union had an open market in the food and feed situation, you certainly will have a different kind of impacts. So in this case, when you shut the market down, you have to make some impositions, and we understand that. If you go, and you mentioned that very quite and clear, for the organic side, you have to get in the other side. So that's one of the reasons that the European Union model of Green Deal didn't make a good assessment about biomass. In our kind of agriculture, we use biomass because we had this solution and we are open market. So we change ethanol with United States and import and export. It's not a case. So if you restrict that, you have a different kind of impacts in the whole channel. Yeah? The reduction of endolance, that's very interesting what you do. And the techniques used in European Union are not necessarily the same techniques that you use in tropical side. And the fixation of nitrogen is, if you have the direct plantation, is completely different. So if you use that and look the impact for the European point of view, it's okay, but it's not okay for tropical land use. And getting for this side, the leakage also, yeah, the leakage is quite clear what you put on, and it's correct. And when you say, okay, I need 1.5 million hectares forest, and you say, well, that could be a deficit worldwide, and maybe that could be the greatest deficit in Brazil, that maybe is not the reality, because we not need necessarily get into deforestation. So there are some areas where the reality is so different that the model getting from the assessment of the predictions are that what you put on one side. What we consider in our scenarios that we are doing is, in the end of the day, a very interesting thing that maybe it's similar than yours. First of one, now with what the European Union is providing with the Green Deal, also with the additional laws about deforestation, CBAM or something like that, the scenarios that will outcome is very clear that the consumer, the European consumer, and in the last way out is the other consumer, will pay a higher price. That's clear. And this higher price makes the second question. Is it okay if they pay a higher price and you have the real effect on the GE or in other side, And here we have a huge doubt. In a certain aspects, they will not have this effect that European Union is expecting. So this should be the discussion in the end of the day, because in the policy side, and you put it in a completely right form, is a policy aware that his consumer is also a voter? In the next 5 to 10 years, will he vote the system who increases the prices? And in the end of the day, the results of the reduction of gas effects and a reduction of deforestation is not that what would be expected. And last but not least, Professor, it's very interesting now. We have, and I suppose you have seen it also, the report of President Biden in response of the Executive Order 40072, the same issue about deforestation and in the area of climate change. The United States will propose a completely different approach for Latin America or for the world, is to go on PPPs in the different branches of feed and food provided, and see what kind of measures could be in an impact in technology or in getting different management, but looking consumer and producers and the channel as a whole. So it's a dialogue for positive impacts. And what we see, unfortunately, in the European aspect, it's a dialogue getting out from a permission that's not our, in front of the others, so that you have to adapt yourself to these kind of laws, and the dialogue is over the law that has been edicted. It's quite different, these attitudes. And in the end of the day, excuse me to be so very clear and hard, European Union will partners like Latin America, especially like and Mercosur, while others, maybe US or even Asia, is coming more and more together. A comprehensive dialogue. So you see, I have here Brazil and German characteristic of our brands, and I would happy if we could make a great change mindset of the European Union, in the mindset that the dialogue, not the laws, and not of rules that we have difficult to adapt, and the results will be a great doubt for all the societies. So thank you so much, Professor Henning, for giving us this input, and thank you so much, Ingo, to be our ambassador between bridges. And I apologize that I cannot stay for the debate. I have now here an appointment with the Chamber of Commerce about the impact of the Mercosur European agreement for the industry.
Thank you very much, Ingo, for your insights, for your comments. And we certainly will stay in touch about the topics you mentioned, and even about other topics. Thank you very much to have participated. Now I would like to present
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I would like to present Fernando Zellner. He is not only the responsible for the agriculture policy dialogue at the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. He is a highly respected and highly respectful professional, and has already participated in a series of our webinars and events on very different topics. Fernando Zellner is a high-level diplomat allocated at the MAPA and quite familiar with Brazil's whole international agriculture diplomatic agenda, including Green Deal, European Union, deforestation regulation, food systems, transformation, G20, G7, BRICS, climate issues, and so on, just to mention some. Thank you very much to be with us today, Fernando. You have got the floor. Please stick to 7 minutes, or if you want 8.
Thank you very much, Ingo. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, so thank you very much. Good morning to you all from Brazil. It's still in the morning here. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Ingo. It's a real pleasure to be here today, participating in this important debate on some of the impacts of the EU Green Deal and farm-to-fork strategies on agriculture in the EU and Brazil. I want to thank, obviously, the Germany and Brazil Agro-Political Dialogue for organizing this event, especially my good friends Ingo Melches and Carlos Alberto Santos, who work tirelessly to promote important policy discussions and build bridges, as Ingo Plöger mentioned, helping to bring Brazil and Europe and Brazil and Germany in particular closer together. I want to also thank Professor Christian Henning for his brilliant study and for the excellent presentation today, which I think give us a lot of food for thought and obviously help to set the scene for this discussion. And I also want to greet my fellow panel members. It's a privilege to be here with you today, and also want to salute all the attendees. I see a lot of familiar names. Is happy to have you here today. So the world we live in today is standing before a critical juncture in its path to sustainable development. So while we must devote our energies to combating the impact of climate change and global warming, which are brought about, and this we must remember, not by food systems, by agriculture, or by deforestation, but by the burning of fossil fuels by industrialized nations over the last 3 centuries. We must work to simultaneously both produce enough food to feed the additional 2 billion humans who will be born in the next half century, but also to create an unprecedented wave of social inclusion and economic growth that will lead us to eradicate hunger and poverty. So these are essential elements, food production, economic growth, social inclusion, that must also be included in our considerations when we think about the environment, when we think about sustainable development. And as the only economic sector that can actively decarbonize, agriculture obviously has a critical role to play in this process as part of the solution. So agriculture can generate income, produces food, economic services, ecosystem services, sorry. So all of this contributes to a balanced achievement of the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And this is an absolute priority for Brazil. I think this is important for us to focus because in my view, some of the points that were made by Dr. Henning sort of prioritize the environmental perspective. And you know, Brazil has a lot of concerns regarding food security, regarding trade, a number of other issues. So for this promise of agriculture to be fulfilled, it's essential that countries and economic blocs can formulate their own strategies, define their targets, establish implementation schedules, and so on. And this is where the Green Deal and the Farm-to-Fork strategy come in. So they represent the strategy of the European Union and its member states to achieve the goals they set themselves through their own national processes, as well as through multilateral regimes such as the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. So this is a fundamental point, because I think this is why the Green Deal makes sense for Europe. It was made by Europeans, for Europeans, according to European priorities and characteristics. But we have to remember also that other countries have their own national plans and strategies as well, which are formulated according to their own reality and to their own priorities. I think Ingo Plöger talked very well about some of the differences between agriculture in Europe and in Brazil, and this is very important for us to take into account as we see how some of the parameters of the Green Deal and Farm-to-Fork strategy adapt to agriculture in Brazil. So we have a different strategy. We've developed a strategy that is based on sustainable intensification of agriculture. This is basically based on the idea of increasing productivity in order to reduce emissions per unit of production. And here again, Ingo talked about the use of pesticides that cannot be considered as a sort of an absolute value per hectare, but rather per unit of production, because Brazil has more than one harvest per year on the same land. So this makes sense in Brazil because the tropical agriculture that we have developed over the last 50 to 60 years includes many practices that contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing carbon capture. Obviously, the challenge we have is to make sure that these practices reach all farmers everywhere. There are currently many pockets of inefficiency, of poverty, where farmers don't have access to these practices. So this is our challenge. But our strategy also makes sense because Brazil has many millions of hectares of low productivity pasture land, which could be restored and if well managed, can go back to producing food and also provide better environmental outcomes, such as ecosystem services. So this also reduces pressure for deforestation while enabling increases in food production, economic growth, social inclusion. So again, this is the emphasis on the balanced view between the pillars of sustainable development. So the restoration of low productivity pastures is one of the big priorities for Minister Favaro in the current administration, and it's one of the pillars of Brazil's low carbon agriculture plan, which encompasses 7 technologies in total, 7 practices, including restoration, and which aims to cover 72 million hectares of Brazilian land and mitigate over 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. So here again, we see an issue of scale. Dr. Henning mentioned as one of the benefits of the Farm-to-Fork in one of his slides, an additional gain of 1.4 million hectares of forested land. Well, the ABC plan in just in terms of forest, of planted forest, for example, has a goal of 4 million hectares by 2030. In terms of conversion of low productivity pasture to agricultural land, our target to 2030 is 30 million hectares. So we see that that this is adapted to Brazil's scale, to Brazil's reality, and obviously can make a much better impact since it is tailored to Brazilian conditions. So obviously the point here is to say that there's no one size fits all solution. What makes sense for Brazil doesn't necessarily do so for the EU, and vice versa. And so this is the issue that we see with some of these movements by the EU to internationalize parameters of the Farm-to-Fork and Green Deal. The idea that you can simply transpose what fits in one place to another place negates the individualities of each country. And in essence, it creates a huge barrier to international cooperation, which is something we need badly in order to make collective progress against climate change. Regarding the specific impacts of the Green Deal and the Farm-to-Fork on agriculture in Brazil, we continue to have many doubts about these contributions and how they will contribute to Brazil achieving its own national goals. Studies like Dr. Henning's actually raise the doubts that we have when we talk about increases in food prices, reductions in production. There's other studies as well. The USDA, I think in 2021, came out with a study that predicted a huge rise in food prices and a drop in production in the EU. And this could lead to possibly millions more people in situations of food insecurity around the world. And this is an important concern, is something we have to take into account. So in addition to these issues of increases in food prices for consumers, which is very critical for Brazil, we have around 10 million people in situations of hunger and many more in situations of food insecurity. But there's also concern regarding other measures such as EU deforestation legislation, maximum residue levels, agricultural subsidies, trade restrictions, all which negatively impact the playing field of global trade and don't necessarily contribute to environmental goals. So we're negatively impacting trade without necessarily getting positive results in terms of environmental services. Another point Dr. Henning made during his presentation was the mention that many Farm-to-Fork policy interventions are not validated by a scientific foundation. Again, this is very concerning because when you move away from science, you move towards arbitrary standards. And then, you start using these standards for other purposes than for the protection of life, the protection of health, and you start getting into trade protectionism, into other issues which are precisely what we don't need in agricultural trade. I was also a bit surprised to see to hear from Dr. Henning that we cannot rely on global markets, because we see trade as a vital engine to promote sustainable development, food security, and environmental sustainability, especially because self-sufficiency is not a viable model for most countries in the world. So we have to take into account, that there's more than 800 million people in the world in situations of food insecurity, and trade is a vital tool for these countries to make sure that they have access to balanced food production. And then the issue of food security, which I mentioned a few times, but which I understand was absent from Dr. Henning's study and from his presentation. So it's interesting to speak about economic welfare aspects and environmental aspects, but to ignore it, such an important issue like food security, which we obviously feel would very much alter the predicted impacts of the farm-to-fork policy. So, in conclusion, let me just say that this doesn't mean that Brazil and EU have different goals. I think we share a commitment towards sustainable food production and towards the fight against climate change. But it's essential that we respect each other's realities, as the strategic partners that we are, and try to work together to enhance each other's positions rather than to impose our views on one another, so that we can solve our differences and effectively make tangible progress in terms of sustainable development. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm happy to take on questions in the discussion further on. Thank you very much, Ingo.
Werner, thank you very much for your clear and kind words. And now I have the great pleasure to present Joana Chiavari. Joana holds a doctor in analysis and climate governance. She's research director at the Climate Policy Initiative of the Pontificia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, better known as PUC-Rio. Joana has just published a very remarkable knowledge piece on climate transition in agriculture and livestock in Brazil, and how public policy will support or will need to support the path to a low carbon agriculture. Joana also represents today the Brazilian coalition Climate, Forest and Agriculture. As many of you know, the coalition is a broad alliance of organizations from civil society, private sector, NGOs, and academia in order to promote a qualified and science-based debate on public policies concerning sustainability issues in agriculture, livestock, and forest in times of climate change. Joana, we are very happy to have you here in this webinar. Thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor. Please, 7 minutes or 8 if you want.
Thank you very much. It's difficult to be last, especially talking after Fernando Zellner, but I'll do my best to bring some comments or to replicate some of the things that I heard. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon for those connecting from Europe. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Ingo, and the organizers of the event for the invitation to contribute to this discussion, to greet the other panelists that are sharing this virtual table with me today, and to congratulate Professor Henning for the very insightful and interesting study presented on the impact of the farm-to-fork strategy. Actually, I have 4 comments that I'd like to share with you as reactions to the study presented. First of all, I'd like to address an issue that was not considered in the study itself, but that could affect its results. According to the study presented, depending on the implementation of the strategy used, the Green Deal implies a reduction of domestic supply of agricultural commodities in Europe, This would result in increase in international prices for agricultural products and an increase of imports from non-EU countries into the EU. So the study concludes that being one of the largest producers and exporters of agricultural commodities, Brazil would benefit economically, and farmers in particular via trade effects. However, what the study does not consider is that in 2023, the European Union published the EU deforestation-free regulation, which is also part of the context of the European Green Deal, and that adopts international trade policies to promote its climate ambitions. And this new regulation, it aims to ban the import and trade of some agricultural commodities from deforested areas after 31st December of 2020. And this includes cattle and soy that were mentioned in the study, but also other commodities as well as their derived products. So according to this new regulation, products will have to go through a due diligence process to prove that they meet environmental requirements of production before entering the European market. And the due diligence procedures will vary depending on the classification of countries by deforestation risk, for instance, as low, normal, medium, or high. So for instance, for medium or high-risk countries, the geolocation of all plots of land where the commodities were produced is required. Consider the entire production chain. This regulation impacts the scenario described in the study, because although Brazil is one of the largest producers of agricultural commodities, the country still has a scenario of high rates of conversion of native vegetation. So it's not evident that Brazilian producers will increase exports to the EU and that they will benefit economically from the Green Deal. Depending on how Brazil is classified and which due diligence process is applied, this will have greater or lesser impacts on agricultural export sector. The second issue I'd like to stress is that Brazil is a country with sophisticated technological tools that can assist the operators in promoting the due diligence system, and that the country has a vast array of public policies to promote sustainable agricultural production that is not linked to deforestation. So it is of Brazil's interest to pursue and implement these tools and policies. As an example, Brazil has advanced deforestation monitoring systems in place. It has developed the Rural Environmental Registry, the CARRA, which includes georeferenced information of areas with forest and agricultural use that is currently being implemented. And there are initiatives for traceability, monitoring, and certification, which are taking place. So using and improving these existing mechanisms that are in the process of being implemented in Brazil, even when we consider like for compliance with EU requirements, this would be key if the EU is serious about advancing international cooperation, because otherwise the EU regulation can be seen as a measure imposed unilaterally, as it was said before. A third point I'd like to raise, and that was also mentioned in different ways by both Ingo and Fernando, is that the idea supported in the study presented that higher agricultural prices increase intensification, as well as land use change towards agricultural production in non-EU countries, resulting in higher greenhouse gas emissions, is not necessarily true for Brazil. Empirical studies, including analysis from CPI, they have demonstrated that the country can more than double its agricultural productions via increases in productivity and converting degraded and subutilized land without promoting deforestation and at no cost to environmental preservation. And this is due to misallocation in Brazilian land and use and inefficient resource allocation. So considering Brazil's large land area and the extensive portion of this area occupied by pasture, there is substantial physical potential for increasing production and reducing emissions by converting degraded pasture lands into crops. Finally, the fourth and last issue that I'd like to raise is that the study points to the increase of commodity prices in Brazil, which poses food security issues, but an additional consequence of the EU regulation, which intends to promote global climate transition, is that it can actually become a barrier to the delivery of a just transition in Brazil, as the EU obligations can have greater negative impact on small producers and traditional communities that will have more difficulties in complying with the requirements of the EU regulation. So these were my initial contributions, and I wanted to make in this first round, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much.
Joanna, thank you so much for your 4 points. Very clear, very interesting. And now I would like to try again, Hans-Peter. You have the floor again. Hans-Peter is our representative of the of our German Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and one of the responsible for Brazil and for the agriculture policy dialogue. Thank you again. Let's try to hear your remarks and your comments on the study and what you have heard up to now.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me now better. You can hear me?
Let's go. Let's go. It's not so good, but let's try.
Okay, you will try, and I can also contribute my points and my notes afterwards as well. Yes, first of all, again, thank you very much for the invitation to this event. And yes, as Ingo already said, my name is Hans-Peter Landen, and I'm the country desk officer responsible also for Brazil. And I've been asked to explain the position of our ministry and the Green Deal, and especially on the Farm-to-Fork strategy, and I'm happy to do so. And due to the technical problems, I'm not the introducer anymore, but yes, I will try to make a virtue out of this necessity. And let me start with the coalition agreement of our current federal government. The coalition agreement of the 3 parliamentary parties forming our federal government states, we are particularly committed to a consistent external climate policy and climate justice in the spirit of the European Deal, the 2030 agenda, and the Paris Climate Agreement. And as you know, the Farm-to-Fork concept is the European Union initiative that aims to improve the sustainability of food systems by looking at the entire food chain from production to consumption. The Farm-to-Fork strategy is part of the Green Deal, a package of policy initiatives to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. It is aimed at making the EU food system sustainable. And for our ministry, there are some initiatives very relevant. The action plan for organic farming, for example, communication on sustainable carbon cycles, carbon farming, sustainable use regulation, and so on and so on. And our government is committed to the consistent implementation of the Farm-to-Fork strategy, which aims to implement legislative and non-legislative measures by 2024. You already know the target of the Farm-to-Fork strategy, like reducing nutrient losses, reducing the use of plant protection products, and so on. and from the side of our ministry, a large-scale restructuring of agriculture and food in Europe must be tackled that takes into account food security, but also ecology, climate change, and social impacts. And our ministry is rigorously pursuing the restructuring of animal husbandry and the achievement of an organic farming model. The expansion of organic farming strengthens the food sovereignty in Germany and Europe, and we want to push up for the reduction of all chemical synthetic means of production, especially nitrogen fertilizers, most of which are important. Organic farming is based on a regenerative practice that aims at farm autonomy and response to the major challenges to the environmental and climate crisis. It is right and urgent that Germany and its partners secure the supply and review our dependencies. The long-term security of our food supply will only be possible if we farm in a much more resource efficient way in the future and in harmony with our national livelihood. So the position of our minister. Environmental protection and sustainability. So let me come to some aspects. Environmental protection and sustainability. The Farm-to-Fork strategy aims to reduce environmental impact of food production by reducing the use of pesticides, protecting biodiversity, and promoting sustainable farm practices. The EU can help minimize the environmental impact of agriculture. This will contribute to better conservation of natural resources in the long term from our point of view. Health and consumer protection. The Farm-to-Fork strategy emphasizes healthier food and the reduction of harmful residues in foods. This could improve consumer health and increase their confidence in food. Market access and diversification. The Farm-to-Fork strategy is not a strategy to be more protectionist. It could also serve to open up the European market to a wider range of products by imposing requirement of sustainability, environmental protections. Countries that are already strong or investing in this area could have a better chance of selling their products on the European market. In general, sustainability goals and trade policy must be more coherent, and in this regard, I'm really happy that Mr. Zahn highlighted all dimensions of sustainability, not only ecology, the ecological dimension, also the economic and social dimension, which is also really, really important. I think it's a question of balancing out this three parts of the triangle. And so our ministry wants to use international trade as an instrument for promoting international global sustainability standards and prevent production relocations. We also see the problems of leakage effects, of course, and I think in this regard, it's important to stay in dialogue and to better exchange about the mutual understanding about what we understand or what kind of concepts we have for promoting more sustainable agriculture. At the same time, we need rules-based and free trade systems and want to strengthen and diversify our trade relations. Therefore, our government pays attention to the compatibility of all, especially unilateral measures with WTO law. And we see also a need to better communicate that the Farm-to-Fork strategy is not about closing off the EU, but about achieving together sustainability goals which are internationally recognized. And therefore, an intensive dialogue with our trading partners is needed in the run-up to and during electoral measures, as well as offers of cooperation and support. So innovation and technology is an important issue in this regard. The requirement of the Farm-to-Fork strategy could create incentives for innovation in agriculture. New technologies and practices could be developed to meet the requirement standard, which in turn could lead to improved production methods and more efficient use of resources. And at last point, I want to stress that the EU Farm-to-Fork strategy has several objectives, including environmental protection, health, consumer protection, and the promotion of sustainable agricultural practices. And the debate on its impact on international trade and relations between countries is very complex and requires, yes, an intensive dialogue, which we are doing here at the moment. And I see we are at the kind of starting point, and I think it's not a question of different goals, it's more a question about different concepts, different ideas to reach these goals. And so I'm really happy to looking forward to further discussion, and I'm grateful to Professor Hennington for his presentation, which is very, very interesting and shows us different strategies of Farm-to-Fork, different models. And yes, I'm really happy that we have the opportunity to learn more and better from each other in this way, in this PPD format, especially what are your concepts in Brazil to improve sustainability. I am very curious to learn more about the concept of sustainable intensification of agriculture. And so I regard this discussion today as a starting point. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. This is a starting point, and it's not the final point. Thank you very much for your clarification on the positions of the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. I would, before I hand over to answer Christian Henning, to answer all these issues in 5 minutes, it will be very easy for you. I would like to mention some questions arising in the chat and in the Q&A, starting with the question of Sylvia Andre about impacts of land use practices, land use changes of GHG emissions. Manfred Kupka wants to know, do you see negative impacts on Brazilian agriculture and EU Green Deal while the sustainability deforestation concerns expressed following the EU CELAC summit? I think it was about two weeks ago. Gabriel Siqueira asked, from my understanding, there is also an important component of the European Green Deal regarding the non-violation of human rights and traditional communities displacement. We still see in Brazil today a lot of social conflicts in the rural scenario and political difficulties from the current government to surpass this challenge. In addition, we've seen institutional instability for this agenda in the past years in governments and in certain future regarding this agenda until 2030. What would be the plan B then? Increase imports from countries with less restrictive social environmental policies. And let me see, I think there was a final question from Bettina Rudloff. Hello, Bettina, from the Foundation Politics and Science. It's good to see you here. Could one model cumulatively relevant issues like Farm-to-Fork and EU deforestation regulation and EU Mercosur FTA? So how they'll be they all together? The question is about, is there a lot of cumulative and additional environmental and social aspects, and what about the EU Mercosur agreement? Christian Henning, professor, you've got the floor, and you will make it in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, I try my very best as last time. So yeah, I will start with the comments, and I will try to answer them by aggregating my answers, because there are some similarities between the comments. One big point was that basically the question was raised by the commentators, to what extent the Farm-to-Fork would also be a strategy for Brazil. And of course, for many reasons, which also the comments already mentioned, this is rather questionable, and this was definitely not the idea of the presentation and also of the report. So it is a study about what is the strategy with the EU and what are the impacts on other countries. And then the question is, well, is this also a roadmap for other countries? And here I agree. First, if something is optimal or not depends on the different goals. We have multiple goals. The commentators mentioned this. And of course, it's up to a society how important are specific ecosystem services compared to other things like poverty, like nutrition, like also economic growth. And if this is different, the strategy is different. The second thing is, of course, just from a technological point of view, agriculture in Brazil is different than in Europe. And so if I do any measures, then the impact of these measures on everything is different. So we have to model Brazil then. That's actually what we want to do. For example, we can use globiomes. There are other models and which are much more particular than Capri. Capri has a very, very reduced model of the Brazilian agriculture, which does definitely is not good enough to do everything we did for the EU, also for Brazil. But just that you know, I'm looking for partners, and the next thing I will do, I did it in Indonesia, I did it in almost all African countries. So I definitely will do it in South America, and I want to start in Brazil to do the complete options of food system transition in Brazil, and then we need another model than the Capri model. So I agree. And the second thing which also came here into was, and I like this, that to what extent, I mean, I would put it under the imperialism of values, to what extent it is really a smart strategy to really impose. I do not say that the European Union does it, but this might be a little bit the discussion, impose specific values, even let's say protecting forests, and to impose values from one society to another. I think this is a very, definitely it's true that first of all, these things are within a society in itself, and I don't think they can be easily imposed. So one has to take care, especially if we combine this, it's all a little bit more complicated. If we use now trade measures because we think CO2 emissions might be too high in Brazil, then one has to see that we have already a Paris Agreement, and that in the Paris Agreement, and maybe there are other agreements, Brazil was part of it, Germany was part of it, the European Union is part of it. There are commitments. And it is a strategy, a national strategy of the different nations which are committed in the Paris Agreement, how they want to deal with this. And if some things they should do it over land use change, and other things they should do it by restricting chemical industry, then I don't see why a particular country can tell other countries how to do this. right? I can understand that if we have an agreement on climate and countries do not fulfill the agreement, there might be some punishment mechanisms. But as long as countries fulfill the agreement, I don't see how any country can impose particular things on particular sectors. This is not so easy, because otherwise you can always go, well, no, we don't want the German cars, because the German car industry, what they do at the moment, using gas technology for energy, we don't like this. Okay, so this is not so easy, and this also relates now to the Mercosur agreement. Of course, it affects in a way the farm-to-fork and also the leakage effect, because simply in the Mercosur, basically that's the idea, is just to intensify trade between South America, the Mercosur countries, and the European Union. That's the idea, right? And of course, part of it is that this trade also relates agriculture. So if we have an additional agreement, everything what happens in terms of trade will be easier, will be bigger than what we model. So there is an effect. Now, the question is again, what is it in quantitative terms? Does it really make a big difference? And the second thing is, does it really change the picture on the complete thing? And this is not so easy to answer, but one also has to see again the other side. It's not only about agriculture, it's also about non-agriculture. And then one has to consider the complete thing. And this is maybe from Bettina, the question, yes, we would need models which combine these things together to see what is then a good strategy and what is not a good strategy. But one thing we have to see, I like, at least from my point of view, and this is what I call imperialism of values. I think it's never a good idea to impose values on other countries. I think it's always a good idea to make a dialogue and also to find compromises. For example, if the Europeans really think we should much more spend money on saving the rainforest in Brazil, which I think it's legitimate to have this idea, then it would be the best to have a market for this where Europeans just can pay for this. Right? So instead of restricting Brazil to do things, we can improve like global permit trading. We can introduce markets where we can and then find a compromise on these different values. So this is this. Now there are still some technical things, but because I'm a scientist, I want to answer this. I know that maybe this is not of interest to everyone, but all these technical points, I disagree. So this percentage of pesticides, right? And it's a difference if I have more or less harvests. Just short, we model basically the cost spent on pesticides and reduce this. It would not make a difference if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harvests. First. Second, in general, if we want to improve this, it is not a question of how much pesticide I use. It's a question of what is the impact on biodiversity. So what we need to understand is what is the impact on biodiversity. This could be different in Brazil than in Europe. And then, of course, we would get a different perspective. Second thing, open and closed market. It's simply not true that the European Union is a closed market. Okay. So in trade from almost all agriculture products are compared to what we had in the mid-80s are very, very low. For cereals, it's low. Of course, it's not zero, but at least we have net trade. And the question is, once we have net trade, the comparative statics, so basically the change in trade, so the response of trade does not depend on the protection level. Okay, so you cannot use protection level as an indicator of low or high response. It's simply wrong. Next, of course, tropical farming is different, and of course, it's a very reduced model, but Capri has a model of Brazilian agriculture. And as I agreed already, we need better models to do a strategy on Brazil. But of course, we did not use the European agriculture model to model something which happened in Brazil, and of course, not land use change. Okay, so it's also wrong. And then the last thing is with the higher consumer prices and the net benefits, of course, we consider this. I mean, these are the welfare measures. And on the other side, we also had our own surveys on willingness to pay for ecosystem services. So what I presented are net benefits and not anything in gross benefits. So I disagree with this. Now, then Fernando, that was the Ingo part. Now, Fernando, also many things I've totally agreed. I said this already. And of course, we need a special strategy for Brazil. This is not the strategy for Brazil. That's all okay. Now, food security. First, I didn't present it, that's correct. But in the deriving the optimal strategy for the European Union, we also took food security into account. And so it is in, I just want to say this, but you are right, I didn't mention this. I even think I did not mention this in the report. So they've taken point, but we did this. But food security is also not so easy, right? I mean, there are studies, for example, very good studies from in the former director of Africa of IFPRI, now Academia 2036, and they made a huge study and showed that it's a very heterogeneous picture. And what happens if we have now farm-to-fork, what happens really on the poor, right? And one thing is, just as an idea, food for thought, if we have increased agriculture prices and I'm a farmer selling this product, it's a good. If I'm the poor, I gain. So, for example, we did own studies. The most losers, for example, in a country like Senegal is middle-class income in urban cities from increased food prices. So it's not so easy, right? There are losers, there are winners, but it's not so easy. So one has to look into this. And second, the quantitative effect is also an interesting question. And then if you really think food security, this is something what the Farmer Association also entertains very much in Europe. They now want to save the poor and the hungry people. But you know, if you really want to do it, don't do it with not being sustainable. There are better measures, right? Just collect money. Transfers are the best and effective measure against poverty and hunger. So if you really want to do this target, you have much better policies. You cannot use this for not being sustainable to save the people in the world. No, if you want to save the people in the world, there are much better measures. But we see, at least in Europe, obviously, this tendency is not too big, right? We don't do too much transfers. So that's the thing. And the last thing is trade and global market is not the same. I did not say that trade is not good. I said the global markets do not deliver. Right? And for example, take the German perspective, relying on cheap gas from Russia, this is the global market. Now we see, oh, it's not reliable because they don't play with the rules all the time. So you have to consider basically trade is good, but the mechanisms you organize the trade in global markets has much higher transaction cost than you might think. So basically you have to think about innovative things like clubs. And in the old days, think about this, we also traded in clubs. We did not trade it on global markets. And we need innovative clubs. This is at least where my group works on. And this is what I meant. So trade and markets is not the same. So this was the comments to Fernando. And then I have some comments to Joanna. Now I have to find this. Sorry. I also agree with very much things. Let's start with this. Sorry, I might not find all the points, but I also agree that there is a danger, definitely a danger, that this overemphasis on sustainable or leakage effect in countries like Brazil might be just used as a hidden protectionism, right? So there might be an opposition in the European Union telling, well, we have this high leakage effect, because the main thing is they simply don't want to be substituted by nice and good products from Brazil. So I see this danger, so one has to be careful there. I also mentioned this imperialism of values. Then you also brought this food security impacts, and you also combined this that there might be negative impact of the farm-to-fork strategy on other aspects. And there was also a very interesting question about social conflicts in rural areas. And yes, of course, there are many things. I mean, we cannot consider everything in one study, but there are many, many perspectives. What I think it's interesting is how far do we want to go? I mean, for example, this is how I understand the public question. Well, now, do we also want to restrict trade with a country like Brazil? This is just hypothetical, what I'm saying. I don't say this is a fact, just because we think they do not deal correctly with rural or social conflict in their rural areas. Is it a way we can can go if a democracy like Brazil does a specific policies which might be non-optimal. We also have a lot of non-optimal policies in Germany. And do we really think we can take this as far as putting trade restriction on this? I think it's a very difficult and problematic path if we want to go there. I think we should look for others more collaborative, cooperative, and dialogue solutions. I'm sorry for Joanna. I like to say this, but especially your comment, appreciate very much. But at the moment, I cannot find my specific answers to the question, so I apologize. I had it more to you, but because of time, I stop here. There's one general question also, if the connection with the Mercosur agreement. And I said again, yes, of course there is a connection, and but this is a little bit, I mean, to give all these answers, this is a little bit beyond the scope of this study. As I said, the Mercosur is also very much about non-agriculture, and of course there are it's a comparative advantages between Europe and Brazil, and one definitely has to take care also from the European side, and that we cannot take all advantages in the non-agriculture part, but then we want to restrict all these advantages on the Brazil part, and this is of course not a good deal, and I think this is definitely not the right perspective. Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Henning, thank you so much. You put a lot of challenges to the Brazilian side, but also to the German side. That will be take some time to digest. Yeah, but it's a lot of food for thought for all of us. I want to thank you all, Mr. Henning. One of the aspects, or one of the terms you use, is imperialism of values. I think that will be remembered, and we will have to think about it. There are some other question that from Marina, from Imaflora, and Raphael Radi, and Jan Eichbaum, and so on. We won't have time to weigh in that. I want to thank Mr. Henning, the Professor Mr. Henning. I want to Ingo Plöger, who already left, Fernando Zellner from MAPA, Joanna from PUC-Rio. I want to thank Hans-Peter, who is still with us, but you can't see him. And this was a very, very interesting and remarkable event in the name of the agricultural policy dialogue. I want to thank you all, the audience. It was a very remarkable event because there are so many people, some left already, but this is, as we said, only the beginning of this discussion. We talked about EU deforestation regulation, about the Mercosur EU agreement, and organic farming, and so on. Very interesting and interlinked issues. I want to thank you all up until the next event. All the best to you. Good evening to Germany, and bom almoço para os brasileiros. Ciao.
Yes, thank you very much. I also very much enjoyed. So maybe there will be an opportunity to continue. So
you will certainly will.
I look forward to this. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.